Have you ever taken a data log with your handheld tuner, hooked it up to a computer and opened it up? What do all these numbers mean? Today on FiTech Tech Tuesday, we're going to go in depth on explaining what the values mean and how to read a data log. There's a couple of ways to open up a data log. The first way is to use our PC-based software, which we can open up. There's a chart option up at the top that allows you to select data logs. I have a list of data logs here, but I'll select the first one and we'll open it, and we get a menu of options that we can show on a y-axis. So we'll show things like RPM. Maybe we want to know our air-fuel ratio versus our target air-fuel ratio. And so we know when we're accelerating, we'll pop up our throttle position sensor. We'll hit OK, and it will bring up a nice big graph for us. And then we can zero in areas by left-clicking and dragging across, and we could zoom into our data log. Our data logs show with a bunch of x-axis readouts. So we have our AFR, our target AFR, and our TPS, and on the inside we have our RPM. With this one, you may notice that the RPM is really low at the bottom, and we have a scale that goes all the way up to 60,000 RPM. There's a pretty simple way to explain that one, and that is sheerly because at one point in this data log there was an RPM that high, which is clearly a false RPM. But that shows you through the PC software how to see data logs through this menu, and that we can use the scroll wheel, we can scroll across it, and just so you could see it right here, here's our RPM spike when the engine shuts off and reads a crazy RPM, which is part of the reason that this log is being shown right now and the issue that we're having with it. Now, for most people, you may not have a power adder version or an Ultimate LS. So the way to get the data logs is to use either Windows Excel or to use Google Spreadsheets. I have Windows Excel on this computer, so I'm going to use this one, but Google Spreadsheets is very similar. So let's look at the same exact log from the PC-based software, but now in a list form. If we scroll down, you can see there's a list of numbers and a couple of readouts on the right side. But you'll notice all the way at the top, we have a list explaining what each column is. If we scroll down, it disappears, but a way to make that stay is by going to View up at the top and choose the Freeze Pane column. If we choose this option here, Freeze Top Row, no matter what we do now, if we scroll down, the top row stays. Now, all of these values will say different things. Our first column is RPM. The second one is a map reading. This is what the computer looks at instead of vacuum. But vacuum and map are very similar. They're just read in a different scale, kind of like metric or standard. The next column is our coolant temperature. So this is saying 48 degrees is the engine temperature right there. And then we move on to your air-fuel ratio of the engine. Next is the target. Now, if the target and the actual are off, the system will use your AFR trim and learn percentage to correct your actual air-fuel ratio to make it run what the target is. And what you'll notice here is trim will go to a number, and then at a certain point, it will apply it to the learn column, and it will go back to 0. With this engine being as cold as it is, it's removing a lot of fuel. But once we start to get up to temperature, it'll start correcting and coming more to a neutral value. Our next column is fans, whether it's on or not. If it's off, it's 0. When it turns on, it'll go to a 1. If you have two fans, like two fan controls, when the second fan turns on, that's 2. And then when you turn on the AC, if you have AC on, that'll be number 3. Next is our TPS, which is your throttle position if the throttle's opening or closing. your fuel pulse width. This is the time that the injectors are open, and this number is in milliseconds. So the highlighted one right here, 4.07, that's 4.07 milliseconds of fuel. The next one is the injector duty cycle. So that's how hard we're working the injector on a percentage. So 3% is barely using the injector. You may want to be concerned if you see this value upwards of 80%. Once you get over that, you're getting close to maxing out how long the injector can be stable while open, and that could also be a sign that you may need a larger injector to support the horsepower of the engine. The next one is the target RPM of the engine at any given time, and then our IAC steps. So the IAC steps is the position of the idle air motor, and then the next value is IAC learn, which is what it had found the proper learn value is when the engine's at an idle. So though this is reading 125, we want to be between 3 and 10 when the engine's at operating temperature idling, but we do know that it's down lower, and the only reason why this value is higher is more than likely just a cold engine. As the engine warms up, it gets more efficient and it doesn't require as much air to keep the engine running. And further down the line, we have our idle PID, our fuel pump, and fuel flow. These are just calculations in the back of the system. The fuel pump is just running at 99%, which is effectively full on. Fuel flow is a calculation of how much fuel flow is going through the system. And then we have our air temp. Air temp is used along with coolant temp to calculate our cylinder head temp. And then you got your battery and your baro. Baro is the barometric pressure. That's the computer figuring out what the altitude of the engine is. Our alpha N calculation, and then our run state. Idle, it'll read idle, dash, and then there's also tail for deceleration. Dash is more of a steady run state. And then our last three is fault 1, fault 2, fault 3, which these are momentary faults. If you see a value in here and it gets severe enough, if you go to the fault code section of the handheld, it'll display what that fault actually is. Now that you know how to read a data log, this gives you the opportunity to go back to the handheld and tune the system to better fit your engine based upon what you had read from that log. If you're a little confused on some of the stuff in the log and you need a little assistance with what to adjust, definitely feel free to add that to an email it to techmail@fitechEFI.com, and write a little description of the issue that you're having. One of the techs here will be glad to write you an email back explaining exactly what to adjust to get your engine at top performance. Thank you for tuning in to this week's Tech Tuesday. If you have any questions on the video or suggestions for future topics, please comment them down below.